Hey, hello, good afternoon, everyone. This is Catherine Bear with River Network, and thank you for joining us today. We are waiting until the top of the hour to get started, but just want to welcome you to the webinar. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Catherine Bear at River Network, and it's a couple minutes before our webinar on the Dirty Water Rule. So thank you for joining us and logging on early. So we'll be getting started at the top of the hour. Thanks. Make that a half hour. Hey, everybody. This is Catherine Bear at River Network. Thanks so much for joining us today. We'll get started in just a few minutes on our Dirty Water Rule webinar. So thank you for joining us. Get started right at 1:30. Hey, everyone. This is Catherine Bear at River Network. We are going to get started in just about 1 minute. We've got a lot of people logging on, so just getting people a chance to get in. Thanks for joining us. Okay, let's go ahead and get started, everybody. This is Catherine Bear with River Network, and I am here with my colleague April Engel today as your webinar host. And we really want to thank you for joining us for this webinar, which is really, really important given the timing of what's going on right now with the attacks on the Clean Water Act. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. I know we'll have people coming in, and I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, so we will send the recording out with afterwards. So if you don't catch something, you'll have a chance to look at it again. In terms of housekeeping, I think many of you have been on GoToWebinar before, but everyone is muted, and so if you have questions, what you're going to do is put them into the chat box. We will be watching the chat box, and if they are questions for clarification, we will stop the speakers and try to get the clarification. If they're questions just generally, keep them coming in the chat box. We will keep track of them and then take questions towards the end of the webinar so we can take them all at once from both of our speakers. So if you have questions and problems, just also let us know in the chat box. So that's how GoToWebinar works. The other thing I wanted to mention is that there are right now 3 handouts that also we've put up for you that you should be able to download from GoToWebinar, and so those include a comparison chart of different Clean Water Act coverages throughout time, which is really helpful from the Southern Environmental Law Center. We have a fact sheet from the Clean Water for All Coalition and a template letter also from the Clean Water for All Coalition. And so those are available if you can't get those for some reason, you can let us know afterwards and we can get them to you. So thanks again. I want to just say that this is a critical time, and so really thrilled that everyone is on this webinar with us today. And also to point out that River Network, this is a webinar with River Network also in conjunction with the Clean Water for All Coalition. And for those of you who are not familiar with the coalition, it's a broad coalition of environmental, conservation, sports people, and community groups that's engaging and mobilizing Americans to get involved in the fight to protect clean water. I know some of you are already members, but if you're not, I hope you will join both the coalition as well as River Network. So quickly about River Network, we are a national nonprofit that connects community groups, river groups, nonprofits, businesses, agencies around the country together for greater impact for healthy rivers across the United States. And our work spans a number of programs as policy, drinking water, leadership development, and we envision a future of clean water for everyone where we really have a whole network of even stronger champions for clean and healthy rivers who are really well equipped and even more effective than they already are right now to do this job. And so I think this webinar fits right in terms of providing more tools for people to help in this fight for clean water. Thank you so much for those of you who are River Network members. We have free membership and paid membership, but as a paid member, you get really great benefits, including 25% off registration for our annual River Rally Conference, which is coming up in June this year. And it's in Cleveland. It's actually the 50th anniversary of the last fire on the Cuyahoga River, which, as you all know, was what sparked the Clean Water Act. So kind of timely that we're talking about this today. There'll be great sessions on everything from clean water and what to do in the next 50 years to drinking water to leadership development and civic engagement. So I hope you'll consider becoming a paid member and joining us at River Valley this year. Okay, so for our agenda today, in terms of what we're talking about today, super important topic. I know that's why you've all joined us. And the issue is really about the scope of the Clean Water Act. And for many people who have been working on this issue for years and years now, the scope of the Clean Water Act has been debated through the courts, through the agencies, and in Congress for a long time. But suddenly we really are just at such a critical moment for the Clean Water Act and what's facing us today, given that the Trump administration is proposing a really brazen rollback of Clean Water Act protections and going much further than we've ever seen before and trying to really slash protections for our waterways, for people, for communities, for clean water, for wildlife, cutting protection for up to 60% of streams and up to half of the remaining wetlands in the continental U.S. So it's really time to if you haven't already, to learn more about it and to take action, as the EPA comment period is open until April 15th. So we're in that really important time period right now. So this webinar is aimed at explaining exactly what the proposed rule will do and the implications. Ellen Gilinsky is going to talk about that first. And secondly, we're going to talk about how you can get engaged and take action, and Jennifer Peters is going to cover that part. So let me quickly introduce you to the two of them and then hand it over to Ellen for this first part of the webinar. So first, Ellen Gilinsky, and Ellen is president of Ellen Gilinsky, LLC, which she started in January 2017 to work with government, nonprofit, and private sector clients to find environmental solutions. You may know Ellen because as part of the Obama administration from 2011 through 2016, Ellen was Associate Deputy Administrator for Water at EPA. Prior to that appointment, she served as the Director of the Water Division at the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. She was also an adjunct faculty member at Virginia Commonwealth University in Biology and Environmental Studies departments. Also I'm proud to say that she is a current board member of River Network, so we're really thrilled to have her on the webinar with us today. Our next presenter is a good colleague of mine and a member also of the Clean Water for All Coalition, is Jennifer Peters. And Jennifer is the National Water Programs Director for Clean Water Action, and she's been with Clean Water Action since December 2011. And as Water Program Director, she spearheads the organization's national water policy work, including leading priority campaigns to strengthen the Clean Water Act for streams, wetlands, and other waters. She's worked on a number of policy issues and has experience in watershed management in the nonprofit and government sectors. And the picture you see of her there, I stole from her website, and it's just from the other day where Jennifer was testifying at a hearing in Kansas about this dirty water rule. So she has great experience in this area, and we'll look forward to hearing from her as well. So with that, let me turn it over to Ellen. And hold on, Ellen, I'm going to turn it back over to you with your screen.
Okay.
And while we're doing that, I'm going to launch a poll really quickly to just get some feedback from all of you while we're getting Ellen geared up. This is April Engel, and I'm with River Network, and we have a question that we want to ask you. What do you hope to learn on today's webinar? There are some choices there, and we'd love it if you all could answer that poll while we wait for just really quickly for Ellen's presentation to load. So we'll give you all just a few seconds to weigh in. It looks like about 30% of you have weighed in thus far, which is great. Just a few more seconds. Give everybody a chance to tell us what your thoughts are today. All right, so it looks like most of you have had the chance to weigh in, and it looks like in terms of what you hope to learn on today's webinar, you're about 70% of you are wanting to learn about the changes that EPA is proposing. 78% of you say the waters that will be impacted by the proposed changes. 52% on what I can do to help stop the proposed changes, and 52% say support available to help me oppose the proposed changes. So that's great, and I'm now going to close the poll and turn it over to Ellen.
Great. And is my screen showing to folks?
I'm not seeing it yet.
Oh, I'll try it again. How about now?
Yes.
Great. And obviously you can hear me. So thanks, KB and April. And I don't think this webinar will disappoint with what people are expecting. We're going to do all of the above. So I'm really honored to be here, certainly as a River Network board member, and from my past career appointments. And also I happen to be a stream and wetland ecologist by training. So this really, this dirty water rule touches my heart in a bad way. So I'm glad to be able to help frame some comments and guide you through some of the highlights that should really be commented on. So the 2019 Dirty Water Rule is an unprecedented rollback of protections for U.S. waters with no scientific or legal justification given. Got to figure out how to advance this. Okay, so what I'm going to cover in about 20 minutes time frame or so, a background on what are waters of the U.S., a brief overview of the proposed rule. I'm going to highlight what are the key changes from previous jurisdictions under the Clean Water Act and then the 2015 Clean Water Rule, and what are the implications of these changes. And then finally, going to talk a little bit about why states are not able to backstop weakened federal rules. All right. There we go. So waters of the U.S., it was a term used in the Clean Water Act when it was enacted in 1972, because the Clean Water Act said it applies to waters of the United States. So the interpretation of what those waters are really affects all Clean Water Act programs. It doesn't just affect the 404 program, which concerns permits to dredge or fill in wetlands and streams. But for instance, it affects point source discharges, the 402 permit program, whereby any industrial or municipal discharges to a stream of wastewater and such requires a permit and pollution controls. It affects oil spill prevention and response. And it also affects grant programs, because the federal dollars that go to the states and to organizations that belong to River Network and similar grants, they only go to apply to waters of the United States. So the federal grant program is not going to be giving out grants to cover waters that are not covered under the Clean Water Act. So that's an important point to consider. Just having a little issue here advancing my slides for some reason. Here we go. So in the Clean Water Act, the types of waters that are covered under waters of the United States are traditionally navigable waters, which, as the name implies, it's your estuaries and your rivers and big streams where you can actually have navigation on them. The tributaries to these waters, however, tributaries is not defined in the Clean Water Act. Adjacent wetlands and waters, and again, adjacent is not defined. So you can see where we've been having issues all these years. Territorial seas, interstate waters, impoundments of the above, and then isolated or other waters on a case-by-case basis. So that's what we were working on in the Clean Water Act prior to 2015. And then there's also traditionally been exclusions, which are types of waters that are not included in the definition. And for instance, groundwater has traditionally not been included. And then there's also exemptions, which are different than exclusions. So exemptions are for activities such as normal agriculture and silviculture activities. So while the water might still be a waters of the U.S., if you're doing normal agricultural activities in them, that's exempt from needing a 404 permit. So in 2015, EPA signed the Clean Water Rule that we have been working on for many years to clarify the definition of WOTUS. And that's because there were a lot of court cases and a lot of uncertainty around what was a waters of the United States and what wasn't. And it was occupying a lot of time. It was jeopardizing a lot of valuable resources. So based on scientific evidence, including the connectivity report, which was a large document, many of you might be familiar with it, which compiled previously published studies and information showing the connections between downstream waters and their upstream sources and the wetlands, and also extensive public outreach and comment. The rule was put out. The rule clarified key terms such as what is a tributary, what does adjacent mean. It also maintained all the exclusions and exemptions that were in the Clean Water Rule. So the main changes were clarifications. So this is a great graphic produced by NRDC that shows what were the guaranteed protections under the 2015 rule. I shouldn't say were, because based on the outcome of recent court cases, the 2015 rule is in effect in about half the states. So traditionally navigable waters, interstate waters, territorial seas, impoundments, they were pretty much the same. Where the differences were with the 2015 rule, because tributaries were actually defined, and they also and they were defined by using a physical attributes to define them in the field, namely bed and bank and an ordinary high water mark, rather than relying on lengthy studies of hydrology, which were taking place before. And then waters adjacent to categories 1 to 5, and adjacent was defined for the first time. And it was defined in a practical, in the field manner to provide a bright line rather than to have lengthy study to determine if a water was adjacent. And you can see here the bright lines that were drawn. And then there was still the opportunity for case-by-case determinations. So this brings us to the proposed dirty water rule that we have before us. So this proposed rule includes traditionally navigable waters, no change to that. It contains tributaries that contribute perennial or intermittent flow to downstream traditionally navigable waters in a typical year. So first off, ephemeral features are out. And secondly, a typical year, which I'll talk about in a little bit. What does that even mean? It's not defined. It includes certain ditches that convey water if they're constructed in a traditionally navigable water, tidal, or built in a jurisdictional tributary or wetland. So that actually eliminates some other types of ditches, not just upland ditches, which have always been eliminated. Certain lakes and ponds that are traditionally navigable waters. This really wasn't, this was to basically eliminate farm ponds, which were always eliminated, but it does end up eliminating some important isolated waters. Impoundments of a water of the US, that was in there before, and then adjacent wetlands. But they redefined adjacent to mean physically touching or connected by surface flow during a typical year, continuous surface flow during a typical year. That is extremely limiting, and I'm going to go into that in more depth in the slides that follow. Okay, then they went on to list things that are specifically not included, and you can read that here. No ephemeral features whatsoever. That's a change. Groundwater was never included. Ditches that don't meet the definition that they gave in the last slide. And then the rest of these features have never been included, even though they might not have been specifically listed in categories. They were either in the preamble or in other lists. So that's really not a change. So EPA produced this simple infographic that they put out. And what this tells me is things are not that simple and we need to be worried. So, you know, everything that's included in bold is great, but here you have a jurisdictional ditch, and it's jurisdictional because it flows into a traditionally navigable water. But check out this ditch. This ditch also flows into a traditionally navigable water. The only difference is it flows through a farm. That should not be excluded by definition. Now, the need for a permit in it might be exempt if it's a normal farming activity, but that should still be jurisdictional. So that makes you wonder, how those interpretations are going. You can see the effects of them excluding ephemeral waters. They're basically lopping off the headwaters of a tributary system. And of course, that's where the water source comes from. That's where our drinking water comes from. That's where you still get a lot of pollutant removal. So that's troublesome there. If you look at, they're emphasizing areas that are excluded, and just because they're not touching one of these other features, but they certainly could be connected by some overland flow and certainly groundwater flow between these two, and perform important functions for pollutant filtering, for habitat, etc. So this really shows you what's at risk rather than making you feel good about what is covered under their proposal and what's not covered. So that's what I wanted to go over with you. So by implication, the proposed dirty water rule does not include the following very valuable things. So they said they're not including a category for interstate waters, and that's because they said it was unnecessary because these waters would meet the definition of the waters of the US. But that's not true. You can have situations where waters that are not defined as waters of the US, but rather as state waters, cross state lines, like a large wetland area. For instance, the Dismal Swamp in Virginia goes into North Carolina, or intermittent tributary that might not be covered because it doesn't always flow in a typical year. But that could result in non-level playing fields where in one state, the state requires a permit to impact those waters, but in the other state it doesn't. Or you can have unregulated pollution flowing from one state to another. So they make it like an innocuous change, but it really does have implications. Of course, ephemeral streams, or streams that do not have continuous flow in a typical year, are not covered. And in addition to which, they specifically say you can no longer use ordinary high water mark or bed and bank to define what a stream is, which goes totally against stream ecology and science, because banks and ordinary high water marks and a stream bed are landscape signatures that indicate a stream is significantly impacting downstream waters, regardless of the frequency of flow, because you're not going to get a distinct bed or high water mark if you don't have flow for a significant portion of the year. But you're not allowed to use those indicators, so there's a lot of streams that are going to be up for grabs. In addition to which, the proposal also asks for comment on whether they should just regulate free-flowing streams, perennial streams, and not even bother trying to figure out if something flows in a typical year for the intermittent streams. So definitely need to highlight that in comments. The ditch issue, there will be less ditches covered because you can have ditches in wetlands or tributaries that are not considered WOTUS, but are still scientific wetlands and tributaries. So we could be back in a situation where you could ditch a non-adjacent wetland, drain it, and lose it without any kind of regulatory oversight. Lakes, ponds, and wetlands that are non-navigable or isolated are no longer going to be considered as adjacent waters or as waters of the US. So this is certainly problematic. This means millions of acres of prairie potholes in the upper Midwest would not even be considered on a case-by-case basis, which is how they're considered today, both under the Clean Water Act and under the 2015 rule. If they're outside of the linear feet of adjacency, they could still be considered on case-by-case. Here, case-by-case is out. Vernal pools that are wet for several weeks in the spring and provide habitat for key species are excluded. Mid-Atlantic waters such as the Delmarva and Carolina Bays are excluded. Also excluded are a lot of bottomland hardwood wetlands, which we certainly have a lot of those in the Southeast. To me, a classic example in Virginia is the Dismal Swamp, because not all parts of the Dismal Swamp are touching a what would be defined as the waters of the U.S. under this rule. They're separated by berms, and they don't have surface connections. They have groundwater connections. So to think that those areas would not be covered is extremely problematic. So it's really important to provide examples of wetlands in your area, in your watersheds, that would be excluded, especially iconic wetland areas, because EPA and the Corps will have to respond directly to your comments, and they're going to have to address that when you say, well, there's this 100-acre important wetland area for habitat, and the duck hunters go there, and it's providing floodwater control, and that's not going to be covered based on your definition. I think that's really an effective way to comment. Just to look at it another way, many of you may have heard that the Corps and EPA did do an analysis despite claims to the contrary. They did analyses of what would be the effect of the dirty water rule and some different scenarios they were thinking about. And it was in an email to the heads of EPA and the Corps of Engineers. And that was FOIA'd, so we were able to get that information. And here are some pie charts that sort of summarize the situation. And these are in their own words, the agency's own words. So when you look at the effects of cutting out streams that don't flow in a typical year or don't intersect another feature, they use the National Hydrography data set, which is actually an underestimate of the number of streams, especially ephemeral streams. But even looking at the NHD, only 30% of streams across the country are perennial. So the 18% that are ephemeral are not going to be considered regardless. The 52% that are intermittent may or may not be jurisdictional, depending on how far they go with this typical year flow. So that's problematic in itself. When you look at specific areas like the Arid West, 87% of all mapped streams are either ephemeral or intermittent. So you can lose a lot more than what's shown here. So depending on how they define relatively permanent flow could result in a greater reduction. And that's something they're taking comment on, in addition to the words that they have about the typical year. So something to pay attention to, I believe. Very troublesome. Turning to the effects on wetlands. So a wetland either has to touch a water that's covered or be connected by continuous surface flow to a water that's covered. So this graphic is looking at the percentage of wetlands as mapped on the National Wetland Inventory map, again, an underestimate of the wetlands that are on the landscape, and the percentage that actually intersect mapped streams. So the right off, the blue color doesn't intersect any streams. So there's over 50% of wetlands are in jeopardy, might not be regulated under the Clean Water Act because they don't intersect another feature. So that's extremely worrisome to look at that. And again, this is in the agency's own words. They actually said the proposed option of defining continuous surface connection as directly touching the waters of the U.S. may result in 51% potential wetland acreage not being considered adjacent. Yet the proposal still went on. And here's another interesting resource you might want to look at. St. Mary's University in Minnesota developed a GIS-based scenario model and storyboards that would show the results of 3 scenarios on wetland protection in Minnesota, Colorado, and New Mexico. So they picked 3 watersheds, and they looked at a scenario, a most restrictive scenario limiting protection of wetlands to directly adjacent to perennial streams, a very restrictive scenario limiting it to perennial and intermittent streams, adjacent wetlands, and then one that as long as the wetland was somehow connected to another feature. So if you look at, the link is provided here if you want to look at these story maps to give you some ideas of how to frame your comments. So that was a huge amount of information. And luckily we have this table that we modified from Southern Environmental Law Center to summarize the categories of waters and what is covered under the Clean Water Act itself, pre-2015, the 2015 Clean Water Rule, and this Dirty Water Rule proposal. So what I would like to highlight for you is the areas that are in jeopardy, which are possibly the smaller perennial streams and intermittent streams, depending on how EPA responds to additional comments on should they just limit protections to perennial streams. Some interstate waters, as we talked about, ephemeral streams, which are so important for source waters and also for aquatic habitat and aquatic life, are totally in jeopardy. Wetlands that are not adjacent to a traditionally navigable water or tributary are definitely not protected and in jeopardy. And that amount can vary according to how the tributary definition goes. So obviously a lot to be concerned about. I want to finish with talking about what the proposed Dirty Water Rule claims about the role of states and tribes. So when the Clean Water Act was written, it was viewed as a partnership between the federal government and the state governments and tribal governments. But the federal government was to provide consistent environmental protections across the country to level the playing field for both the environment and for business and industry that really depends upon consistent regulations when they do business, not to have something different in every state. So what EPA and the Corps are claiming is that this dirty water proposal rebalances the relationship between the federal government, states, and tribes. It does not. It puts way too much of a burden on the states and tribes. It does not give the states and tribes more flexibility, and I'll discuss that next. And it does not provide a network of coverage in accordance with the objectives and policies of the Clean Water Act. It basically punts environmental protections for waters to the states, and the states do not have the resources to catch that punt and run it back. I can't believe I just used a football analogy, but anyhow, so the intent of the Clean Water Act was not for the federal government to cede most of their authority. Again, I already went over this patchwork of states. So there have been many studies. The best one of them, I think, is the Environmental Law Institute report in 2013, looking at can states take over some of the programs of the federal government in water. And at least 28 states cannot be more stringent than federal rules. They have their own regulations at the state level that say that specifically. And when I say at least 28 states, because some other states, it's a little more nuanced. It says you can be stricter than the feds, but the legislative body in the state has to approve it. So it has to go through the state legislatures, which is quite a process to begin with and likely not going to come out the other end. So total fallacy that states could pick up where the federal government has left off. Now, there are many states, including my state of Virginia, that do have wetlands rules that go beyond the federal, but it will be interesting to see what happens to those rules if the feds really back off, because a lot of those rules were enacted to cover important wetlands in a state, isolated waters, such as in Virginia, the Dismal Swamp, and in the West, prairie potholes and things like that. So not reliable to rely on the states. And furthermore, states rely on federal dollars to run their programs under the Clean Water Act. And if a water is not covered, the Clean Water Act is not going to allocate money to it. So the states are going to have to come up with their own resources. And that's very unrealistic when you look at most states are experiencing decreasing state budgets. They're cutting back on staff. A lot of them have raised permit fees to try to make up the difference, but you can only raise permit fees so much. So that's really not very valid. And I think that's important to state that you cannot punt it to the states. So that was a lot of information, and I'm sure you'll have questions at the end. But right now, I want to turn it over to Jennifer Peters, who's going to talk about how you can comment. But I just want to say, as an aside, since I spent 6 years at EPA, and I read most of the comments on the 2015 rule, your comments do actually get read, especially the specific comments you make that talk specifically about a certain water that will be jeopardized or a certain provision of a rule. And there has to be a response to comment documents. So it is worth spending some time on your comments. So with that, I'm going to turn it over.
Thanks, Ellen. That was great, and a lot to cover. Like you said, you did a great job, and we will take questions at the end. So Jennifer, I'm going to make you the presenter.
And while you do that, I want to launch another poll that is asking a question: what waters where you live or work are you concerned about losing protections? And that poll should come up here in just a second for everybody. And we'll give everybody just a few seconds to vote while we wait on Jennifer to get her presentation loaded. All right, it looks like we have just about everybody has weighed in at this point. So thank you for your responses, everybody. It looks like about 83% of you are concerned about losing protections for wetlands, 72% for intermittent or seasonal streams, 70% for ephemeral or rain-dependent streams, and 55% small perennial streams. All right.
All right. Good poll. Great. And Jennifer, we can see you should be able to share now. I can see it says you as presenter. And
okay.
In the meantime,
because on mine,
whenever you
can't
load up.
Oh, no, I can see it. I got a notification that
you have to press on the side. It says something about share your screen, and you have to press it there as well.
Oh, in two places.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I did it in two places. So hopefully you can see it now.
We can see it. We can see it, Jennifer.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
All right. Yes. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. This is Jennifer Peters from Clean Water Action, and this is an issue that I've been working on for over 10 years, and I know many of you on the webinar as well have probably been working on this for a very long time as well. And it really is, it's not an exaggeration to talk about this as being really the most unprecedented attack we've seen on the Clean Water Act, because what the agencies are proposing to do right now really undermines the clear purpose and goal of the original intention of the Clean Water Act when it was passed in 1972. And, that is because, as Ellen went through, I mean, the agencies are proposing to categorically eliminate protections without really any meaningful understanding of what those impacts will be to public health, to the environment, to endangered and threatened species. And, this whole idea that states will step in to take over is untrue, and in fact, we could see a race to the bottom with states, and that would be then therefore place a burden on states that are down in communities that are downstream of pollution, and that would only create more regulatory uncertainty. And as Catherine pointed out at the beginning, I was in Kansas City last week testifying at the only public hearing EPA is holding on this rule, which is in Kansas City, Kansas. And, I was there for both days of hearing, and it was definitely a 50-50 split as far as, groups that support what EPA is doing, and then those of us that are strongly opposed to this. And, the supporters are the typical industry players that have complained about the Clean Water Act since the very beginning, coal mining companies, oil and gas producers, industrial farmers, real estate developers. And what I found most concerning is that, these interests during their testimony, some of them are even saying, well, EPA, this is too strict. You need to only regulate streams that flow year round, which, as you saw from the slide that Ellen showed, that would only be 30% of all streams. And there was one woman from the Kansas Livestock Association, that asked EPA to only regulate streams that flow at least 190 days a year, which is pretty ridiculous. And, it's important, when we're talking about this rule, to really talk about who would benefit from a rollback in Clean Water Act protections, and who will benefit are, the heavy polluting industries and developers that will no longer have to get permits to pollute a stream, to pollute certain streams, or to fill or pollute certain wetlands. And that cost will then get passed on, and that responsibility for that pollution will get passed on to those that live downstream. And for some reason, my slides are not going forward.
Jennifer, you can try using your right and left arrow and see if maybe that works on your keyboard.
It worked when we were practicing, everyone, so I apologize. I'm not sure what's going on now.
Bottom, like those would show up.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to keep talking because we're short on time while I keep playing with this.
Jennifer,
but real quickly,
if you look at the bottom of your actual slide and move your cursor over there, an arrow will pop up where you can advance it.
Yeah, I am at the bottom of the slide, and there's nothing. There must be something weird with my screen on my computer because I'm not. Okay, wait a second. Oh, there we go. Thank you. All right. Sorry, everyone. So we're about a third way through the 60-day comment period that EPA gave us, and comments are due on April 15th, 2019, although many organizations and states and other trade associations, including the Western Governors Association, has asked EPA to extend that comment period. But typically, even if EPA does decide to extend the comment period, that's not something we'll know about until much closer to that April 15th deadline. So we are certainly operating under the assumption we are only getting until April 15th to do this. And, as Ellen mentioned, it's really important that groups submit individual comments, because with these substantive comments, EPA does have to respond to those. And so the more comments that we submit that have specific examples of things that we're concerned about, that can, slow down the process. Those of you that have been working on this issue for a while, you may recall that the first step of this process under the Trump administration was to propose to repeal the Clean Water Rule. And that proposal, even though it was out well over a year ago, has yet to be finalized. And our community was very successful at getting in hundreds of thousands of comments opposing that effort. And so I think it's important to think about, similar strategy here. The more comments we get in, the more we slow it down. So want to go over some basic suggested talking points. And as Catherine mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, there is a template letter that you can use as a basis for your own comment letter, but it's certainly just the starting point. But when I'm thinking about this issue, I kind of put it into 4 different buckets of why this proposal is so bad. And as Ellen already went through, they're really not following the scientific evidence that really was the foundation of the 2015 Clean Water Rule. EPA had that connectivity science report, which was a review of more than 1,200 peer-reviewed studies, which really synthesized the science of how streams, regardless of how often they flow or how much water flows in them, have an influence on downstream water quality for rivers and lakes and bays and things like that. Same thing with wetlands, especially wetlands that actually don't have a hydrological connection at the surface level can have a strong influence as well. So it's just important to think about how this is really, not only is it not based on science, it's completely ignoring science. It's also important to think about how, even though the agencies are claiming that the previous administration relied too much on science, but that they are, and with their proposal, they're just going to base it on the best available law. But, limiting Clean Water Act protections only to waters with a permanent or consistent flow or with a direct surface connection to other waters, that's an idea that's been rejected by a majority of Supreme Court justices in the past, by the George W. Bush administration and other courts interpreting the act. Another thing that's so harmful about this proposal is that it's bad for our health because it puts drinking water sources for millions of people at risk. And again, EPA doesn't fully account for what those impacts could be. They don't quantify all the risks to rolling back Clean Water Act protections. And also, this proposal will clearly hurt small businesses that depend on clean water, which is essentially, every business that you can think of, from breweries to family farmers to hunting and fishing operations, and also including businesses that restore, that also businesses that do restoration and mitigation for wetlands as well. So, as we already mentioned, it's important that as much as possible, you share local examples of streams or wetlands in your community that you are worried will lose protections under this proposal. And certainly, every state has examples of wetlands that are not connected to other surface waters. And most states also have examples of streams that don't flow year-round. And but at the same time, even if you don't have specific examples in your area, you can certainly talk about, the concerns about water quality in general in your state, especially if you're in a state that hasn't stepped in to protect what resources that already have federal jurisdiction. So I think it's fine to talk about degraded water quality in general. A lot of the testifiers I saw in Kansas City last week talked about that just in general, about, 70% of our waters are impaired, and things like that. And so that can be very powerful. as well to talk about. And so in addition to doing your own individual comments, it's also very important to mobilize other people to comment. And I realize like not everyone is necessarily a member-based organization, but if you are, it's very powerful to mobilize your members to submit comments and also send things like action alerts out to your members. And there is a toolkit available that people can use where we have samples of all of these things. So certainly at the end, I'll have my email for those of you that don't already have it, and you can reach out to me and I can share that with you. But yeah, we have lots of examples in there people can use. And if you don't have the capacity to do your own action alert, you can certainly link to other organizations. Action alerts at the protectcleanwater.org website, which is the website for the Clean Water for All Coalition. We have links to different organizations' action alerts, but also gives you ideas of talking points for your own as well. So I think that's really important. And also I know a lot of our organizations do things, table at events and things like that. And so we also have postcards that you can download and print where you can get people to sign and submit as well to the dockets. So another important strategy for this work is to engage elected officials. And this is something that Clean Water Action and other organizations did a lot of back in 2014 when we were working on the Clean Water Rule. And we were very successful at getting a lot of pro-clean water state and local elected officials to sign on to comment letters in support of strong clean water protections. We also led an effort to get city councils and other county officials to pass resolutions in support of strong clean water protections. And resolutions are useful because of the political message they send, and also they can be easy for city councils to pass because they're not legislation, they're non-binding, but certainly they provide a valuable voice. And I was also encouraged at the Kansas City hearing that a representative from the Attorney General's office for the state of New York was there talking about how New York State is leading a coalition of attorney generals that oppose the dirty water rule because they're concerned about what the proposal will do to drinking water sources and mitigation costs, etc. So just another thing to think about. And if that's something that you're interested in doing in your own community, you can feel free to email me and I can share examples of resolution template and letters that local elected officials have signed on to before. So another thing to think about is, engaging partners that you work with, maybe on non-water related issues as well. And so it was pretty cool last week in Kansas City. We had quite a diverse group of voices talking about the importance of strong Clean Water Act protections. We had, brewers, we had doctors, and people with fishing background and things like that. And so these are just a few of the quotes from our press. We had a stand-up press event right before the hearing began last week, and so that those give you some idea. And I think afterwards we'll be able to share our PowerPoints with all of you that were on the webinar, and you can actually, I'm not going to click on those videos now, but there's links to people's testimonies. So in addition to commenting and mobilizing comments, it's also important that we keep the drumbeat going on drawing attention to this issue. And one way to do that is through submitting op-eds or LTEs to your local paper. And these pieces are an effective way to get the attention of your local elected officials, your U.S. senators, members of Congress, because a lot of them still actually read their hometown papers. And this is very important. And but every newspaper does have its own guidelines, so make sure you check the website to see what exactly your newspaper is looking for. And you also want to think about, they're more likely to publish a piece if it's really personal. So in addition to having personal anecdotes to make it your own, think about including some state-specific examples, concerns about your local water quality, just so your audience knows why that they should care about this issue as well. And in addition to having some facts in there, you also ideally want to end your statement with a specific call to action to call on your elected officials by name and to urge them and others to oppose attacks on the Clean Water Act. And you could even link to your organization's action alert, or even link directly to the regulations.gov website, where people can actually type in a comment and submit it directly to EPA if they want to. So here are some examples of, an op-ed that was submitted in the Washington Post that was talking in general about the importance of protecting streams and wetlands because of the health of the Chesapeake Bay. And that's also a good example of why we need to have strong federal protections, because we have the Chesapeake TMDL, so you have these multi-state partners that are all, contributing, trying to reduce their nutrient pollution into the bay. And if you don't have all states equally invested in protecting those resources, it's puts certain states at a disadvantage. So that's really important to think about. And then also there was another one was in a Charleston Gazette, a fisherman talking about the importance of streams for fishing and things like that. So there's some good examples out there. And in addition to traditional media, a lot of us spend probably too much time on social media, things like Facebook and Twitter, and it can be a really fun way to communicate your message in other ways as well. And so these are just some examples. NRDC has this great Brewers for Clean Water campaign, and this is their Facebook page, and they, have used this to mobilize people to take action on their website. And they also have this really cool video that they did as well that they've been sharing to get people involved. And, we're very active on Twitter. This was Michael Kelly, our communications director, shared or tweeted out this picture right before our hearing, right before our conference call. And so it was just a way to draw attention to what's going on. And we use the hashtag Protect Clean Water and the Dirty Water Rule are the two main ones. And then another thing that we do often is we create memes and other images, which we find gets a lot more attention from our followers. And so there was that infographic that Ellen showed earlier that EPA put together to describe the proposed definition. And I know it's really small on my screen here, but we actually went through and added some additional lines to show, actually, no, these are also connected to other waters of the U.S. and should be protected. And then a group of scientists were in the Everglades and took a picture of them all standing in a wetland that would no longer be covered under this proposal because it was separated by a road. So that's just another powerful way to get out your message. And then blog posts are another fun, easy way to talk about an issue in a more personal way. And John Devine from NRDC has a few blogs up on this issue. Michael Kelly from Clean Water Action and I, we also have several blogs where we talk about this as well. And again, it's just another way to drive people to take your action alerts. And then finally, the Clean Water for All Coalition has different field groups that have been hosting in-person events. And so just last week, there was an event in Pennsylvania at a brewery. So it was a more casual event to get people together to talk about the importance of clean water and talk about this rule. So you can, anything from a casual event to in Maine earlier last month, they had a more formal event, which they were calling a citizens hearing, where they actually had speakers and they had press there, and they got a lot of attention around that and got some media coverage. So just different ideas of things people can do to talk about the importance of clean water and how horrible this proposal is. So as promised, there's my email address. So certainly, if there's any materials that I can help you with, definitely reach out. I know a lot of you are probably already part of the Clean Water for All Coalition and may already have access to some of these materials, but if you don't hesitate to reach out, and I will try to get you what you need. So I guess we'll open it up for questions.
Great. Yeah, Jennifer, thank you so much. This is Catherine with River Network again. And so we have some questions in the chat box, so let me throw a couple of these out real quick. I've been building up over time, and so this one, I'm not sure actually if this was Ellen or Jennifer for you, but I would also throw it out to either of you. We have a question about how does implementation of this go for states that don't map ephemeral streams separately from intermittent streams? And would we have to fund that mapping in order to determine which streams are protected? So sort of the analysis question of impact.
Okay, I'll go ahead and answer that, having run a state wetlands program. The state well, none of these programs rely on mapping, and I'm actually glad you brought that up, because that's a comment that the Dirty Water Rule is asking. Should they just go ahead and map all the wetlands, and then those are the ones that are regulated? And I say heck no to that, because you can't tell. Mapping is never going to be as accurate as what's on the ground. So you just, that's why you have jurisdictional determinations on the ground. So, again, looking for physical indicators and such. So that's what states do. I know in Virginia right now, we do cover isolated wetlands and some ephemeral streams that the feds do not cover even now. And those are just delineated in the field.
Great. Okay, so Jennifer, anything to add to that?
No, I think Ellen covered it.
Okay, great. And we had a question that's been answered, but someone asked, can you connect me with other people in my state who are working on that? And we can absolutely do that. So please be in touch with me or April or Jennifer, and we can help connect with you people in your state if you want to work on letters or anything like that, and you don't already know who else might. So another question we had, which was very specific to California, which was how will this affect California law given the state clean water law they have on the books there? So Ellen, I might throw that to you first.
Did you mean me? KB? Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, again, so in California, it won't affect it at all unless the legislature decides that they, why are we being more stringent than the Fed? So it's really, it's not going to affect those states. There's about less than 20 states that have their own independent wetland stream programs. The only way it would affect that is if, the more conservative members of the legislature start asking, why do we have this? But I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know for sure. But I would bet that California does not have a rule that they cannot be more stringent than the feds, because they always are.
One would think.
KB,
these PowerPoints will be available. Jennifer, there's a question for you on the Clean Water for All Coalition, which is open. Anyone can join it. We have a goal, right, of how many comments to get in the EPA. We were thinking the other day, is it 100,000 we're trying to get into the agency? Is that right?
It's actually 500,000. We have a very ambitious goal. Yeah.
Even more ambitious than I thought.
Because that's
good.
Yeah, that's around. We almost got that many for the repeal a year and a half ago. So I think it's possible, especially if we get an extension. Although I'm not holding my breath that we get an extension, but.
And KB, this is April. I was wanting to launch one final poll to just get an idea from folks in the ways that they're wanting to work to oppose the Dirty Water Rule. So if it's okay, I'll go ahead and launch that, and we can see how many folks are interested in engaging in the different ways that have been outlined today.
That's great. Thank you.
So we'll give that just a few minutes to show up for everybody and give everybody a chance to vote. It's great. So we're starting to see some of your answers come through. You can select all of the ways that you are interested in engaging. So we're getting really good participation. So thank you everybody for weighing in. It's really helpful to see the ways that you're interested in being involved. So we'll give you just a few more seconds to give everybody a chance to record their responses. All right, so it looks like about 92% of you say that you want to submit a comment letter to EPA. Reminder, if you want a sample comment letter, you can email Jennifer, and I went ahead and pasted her email address in the chat box. So if you need to refer to that again, it's there where you can copy it. 44% of you said you're interested in publishing a letter to the editor or an op-ed in your local paper, which is great. Again, Jennifer has resources on that. 66% of you said that you would like to provide examples of local waters that will lose protection. So that's really great to hear. And so please reach out to any of us, Jennifer, Catherine, myself, April Engel, to let us know those examples, or you're welcome to type them into the questions box here today, and we'll capture that. 74% of you say that you're interested in mobilizing others to weigh in as well. That's fantastic. Again, Jennifer has some great resources that can be helpful in terms of how you can mobilize others. And then 64% of you said that you're interested in spreading the word through social media. And again, Jennifer can link you up to some great social media resources, some images, as well as messaging that can be really helpful in that. So please reach out to us and all the ways that we can help you with those items. And thank you for your willingness to work together on opposing this harmful rollback.
Yeah, right. Excellent. And so that's a lot of engagement. It's really great, and we're excited to see that. Someone also asked, this webinar will be available. We'll send out the recording, so you're welcome to use parts, sort of the whole thing, for education in your community too, to get people sort of up and running on what's happening with this dirty water rule. So thank you so much. I don't see any other questions, and so we do have an evaluation we would ask you to send. We're going to put it in the chat box and also send it in the follow-up email. So if you give us any thoughts on how we can continue to make these webinars better for everyone, that would be great. And also, just to let you know, here at River Network, we're happy to help and connect you with Jennifer and other experts, as well as our own staff, to support you on this work. And that also, for coming up deadline really soon on March 15th, if you would like to come to River Valley on a scholarship, to put in a request for that soon. We also have a new award, an Emerging Leader Award, and it's the self-nomination. So those are due on March 15th as well. And so you just go to our rivernetwork.org website, and you can find all that application material. So hope you all will consider spreading the word with that and joining us at River Valley. So let me see if any more questions have come in. Okay, I don't see any. So everyone, I want to thank our speakers, especially Ellen and Jennifer, who are real experts on this, and for their time in getting ready and joining us today and being so helpful. And to all of you for joining us and being part of the work to protect clean water in our communities. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you on a future webinar.